My father called my graduation a failure ceremony. Not a disappointment. Not a waste of time. A failure ceremony. Said it the same way you'd mention rain in the forecast. Calm. Final. Like the conversation was already over before it started. I was 22 years old, holding a handwritten invitation I had spent 30 minutes carefully addressing. 4 years of work. 0 family money. 0 family support. Top of my entire program. And the man who was supposed to be proud of me couldn't spare 3 hours on a Saturday. I hung up the phone. Got dressed. Drove to campus alone. Walked across that stage alone. And when I looked up into those rows of seats and confirmed the 2 faces I already knew wouldn't be there, something inside me went completely still. But in the 3rd row, one woman stood up. Clapping so hard her hands had to hurt. Crying. Screaming my name like I had just done something extraordinary. My grandmother. Margaret Hale. The only person in my entire bloodline who never once needed me to be useful before she decided to love me. I held on to her face that day and made myself a promise. I was done. Done expecting. Done hoping. Done leaving room for people who had already made their decision about me years ago. I almost kept that promise. Then 10 years later, my father called again. And the word that came out of his mouth this time wasn't an apology. It was a request. And what happened after I said yes to that meeting changed everything. To understand why that graduation mattered so much, you need to understand what happened 15 years before it. I was 7 years old when my father sent me away. No fight. No explanation. No moment where a child could grab onto something and make sense of it. Just suitcases that appeared in my room already packed, a car ride that felt too quiet, and one sentence that got recycled in different forms for years. It'll be better for everyone if you stay with Grandma for a while. A while became years. Years became my entire childhood. My family lived in one of those old Boston houses that looked perfect from the outside and felt like a performance on the inside. Everything curated. The right schools, the right dinner parties, the right photos on the right walls. My younger sister Camille fit into that world like she had been built for it. She had my mother's face, my mother's softness, my mother's unspoken and unmistakable preference. I had my father's eyes. My father's jaw. My father's dark hair. And apparently, though I wouldn't understand this until decades later, I had the power to make my mother visibly uncomfortable just by being in the same room as her. My grandmother never said a word against them. She never had to. She simply loved me so completely, so effortlessly, that the difference between real love and careful neglect became impossible to miss. She packed my lunches. Sat through every school concert. Helped me with homework until her eyes got tired and still wanted to finish the chapter. She clapped for me like I was performing at Carnegie Hall even when I was just one nervous girl in the back row of a winter choir concert, barely audible, barely visible. Meanwhile, back in Boston, my family built a life that had quietly erased me from its center. I decided something early. If I wanted anything in this world, I was going to earn it myself. Not ask for it. Not wait for it. Build it. By 16 I was working weekends. By 18 I had a full academic scholarship. By 22 I had a degree in data science, honors attached, and a future constructed entirely from stubbornness and the kind of determination that grows in children who figure out too young that no one is coming to rescue them. My graduation was supposed to be the moment they finally saw what I had done without them. Instead it became one more humiliation I had to survive in public. I mailed the invitation months early. I followed up. I called. I lowered my expectations down to the absolute floor, a text message, a single flower, 2 people in uncomfortable chairs for 3 hours pretending to care, and still, even that was too much to ask. My father called 2 days before the ceremony. Same voice. Same tone. The one that always made me feel like whatever I cared about was slightly beneath his attention. He said he didn't see the point in attending. He said he didn't believe in celebrating mediocrity dressed up as ambition. He said watching me walk across a stage to collect a degree that wouldn't position me for anything significant wasn't how he planned to spend his weekend. Then he said the words I have never forgotten. It's a failure ceremony, Naomi. Not a milestone. Click. I stood there holding a dead phone. Then I got dressed. Drove to campus. Sat in a folding chair surrounded by hundreds of students whose families packed every row, every aisle, every corner of that auditorium. I walked across the stage when they called my name. First honors. Top of the program. I didn't trip. I didn't cry. I didn't let a single thing show on my face. But when I looked out at that audience and confirmed what I already knew, 2 empty seats, exactly as promised, something cracked open behind my ribs that I spent the rest of that afternoon trying not to let reach my face. My grandmother was standing in the 3rd row. Both hands above her head. Tears running down her face. Proud in a way that had absolutely no conditions attached. Later that afternoon, while I was still holding my diploma and trying not to fall apart in the parking lot, my father posted photographs online. Garden lunch in Boston. Crystal glasses. Summer roses. Perfect lighting. Camille at the center of every frame, beaming. I saved the screenshots. I didn't know why I did it then. Maybe some part of me already understood, one day I'm going to need proof that this was real. Fast forward 10 years. I built a company. It started as a small analytics platform designed to detect suspicious hospital billing patterns. It grew faster than I ever planned. Insurance companies wanted it. Compliance firms wanted it. Hospital networks that had once ignored my emails were suddenly requesting meetings. Then an acquisition offer arrived so aggressive I laughed out loud the first time I read the number. I negotiated. Signed. Watched the transfer clear. Numbers so large my accountant said them twice before I believed they were real. The trade press picked it up. My name appeared in industry publications. My calendar filled for the next year. I was earning more in a single month than my father had once implied I'd never see in a lifetime. 3 weeks before his phone call, my grandmother died. That sentence still doesn't sit right when I say it. She was the only steady thing in my life. The only place that had never felt conditional. And when she was gone, the world became quieter in a way I couldn't stand. I stayed after the funeral to go through her house myself. I couldn't handle the thought of strangers packing up the rooms that had held me together. In the back of her bedroom closet, inside a cedar chest beneath winter blankets and letters tied with ribbon, I found a thick envelope. My name on the front in her handwriting. Inside was a photograph. My mother in her 20s, standing far too close to a man who was absolutely not my father. Both of them smiling in a way that had nothing to do with a casual friendship. There was a typed note from my grandmother. It said, "Do not trust sudden kindness from people who spent decades proving you meant nothing to them." And at the bottom of the envelope, a business card. A private investigator named Ethan Cross. On the back, in my grandmother's small neat handwriting, 6 words. If they come back, start here. 48 hours after an article about my company's sale ran in business media, my father called. Warmer than I had ever heard him. Asked how I was. Used my name twice. Said the family needed to reconnect. Said there was a meeting at the house in Boston. Said they wanted to honor my grandmother's legacy together. I said too late. Way too late. Then I hung up. 10 minutes after that he texted. Short, formal, neutral. Said it was about creating something meaningful in my grandmother's name. Not an apology. Not an explanation. An invitation to a meeting already designed around my money. I already knew it was about money before I walked through that door. I just didn't know yet how dirty the rest of it was going to be. I drove back to Boston for the first time in months. The house looked more polished than I remembered. New landscaping. Fresh paint. The kind of exterior that whispers stability even when everything inside it is built on 30 years of carefully managed lies. My father greeted me with a handshake. Firm. Rehearsed. The kind you give a donor you're trying not to lose. My mother smiled with warmth she had clearly been practicing. Camille hugged me with the careful awkwardness of someone who had always benefited from my exclusion but had never once had to say it out loud. Lunch on the terrace. Very civilized. Very staged. Then my father opened a leather folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a proposal for something called the Mercer Legacy Foundation. According to the beautifully designed documents, it would honor my grandmother's memory by supporting overlooked students from fractured homes. It used every word she would have loved. Opportunity. Dignity. Resilience. Educational access. That was the first thing that made me physically sick. Because even before I reached the numbers, I already knew exactly what this was. Camille was listed as executive director, on a salary so inflated it was insulting for a foundation that had not yet helped a single living person. My mother had a consulting stipend. 2 outside vendors were listed at rates that immediately narrowed my eyes. The launch budget was bloated beyond any rational explanation. The oversight structure was nearly non-existent. And at the bottom of the final page, the number they wanted from me. $300,000. As a founding family contribution. My father leaned forward and said, "We know how far you've come, Naomi. We thought this could finally be what brings our family back together." I looked at him across that terrace. This man who had called my graduation a failure ceremony. This man who had packed my suitcases when I was 7 without a single honest explanation. This man who had posted garden party photos while I walked across a stage to collect my diploma alone. And I understood, cleanly and completely, what was actually being offered. They had not come back because they loved me. They came back because I had finally become useful. I smiled. Nodded. Told them I would review everything carefully. Drove back to Maine. Pulled out the card my grandmother had left me. Called Ethan Cross before the sun went down. Ethan Cross met me in Portland the next morning. Went through every document. Looked up at me and said, "If your instincts are already telling you this stinks, they're probably being conservative." The advantage of building a company around fraud detection is that after a while you stop hearing excuses and start hearing patterns. The foundation was registered legally. Which meant they weren't sloppy enough to run something cartoonishly fake. That was almost worse. It had real paperwork. Real bank accounts. Real branding. All the visual legitimacy that money can buy. But when I traced the vendors, things bent in ways that should have been straight. The strategic consulting firm connected to my mother's old friend had no meaningful track record anywhere. The marketing agency had a polished website but no real portfolio and an address leading to shared office space occupied by dozens of shell entities. Every page looked clean, until you understood what clean fraud actually looks like. It is never sloppy at the start. It's elegant, tax-aware, emotionally manipulative, and dressed in the language of doing good. A week in, Ethan called and said he had something I needed to see in person. He handed me a file. Archived photographs. An old gallery program. And a name. Adrian Vale. The man in the photograph with my mother. A well-known architectural photographer in Boston in the early 90s. Magnetic, talented, financially unstable, and according to two people Ethan had interviewed, deeply involved with my mother before her marriage to my father. There had been whispers at the time. Nothing provable. Nothing public. Just enough smoke that my grandmother had quietly held on to it for 30 years, waiting for the moment it might matter. Ethan also found something else. My father was under serious financial pressure. The house had been refinanced twice. Private debt accumulating. A lucrative position nearing its end with far fewer options ahead than their lifestyle suggested. The foundation wasn't just greed. It was a life raft. Built in my grandmother's name. Designed to be filled with my money. But none of that answered the question I had carried since I was 7 years old. Why had I been sent away while Camille was raised in full daylight? That answer came next. And it rearranged every single memory I had spent a lifetime trying to understand. I arranged private DNA testing through a lab that specialized in chain of custody collection. My own sample was easy. My father's came from a coffee mug he had handed me on the terrace, handed it over without a second thought, because people who have always held power rarely imagine the person across from them is quietly collecting evidence. Camille's sample took more effort. A preserved hairbrush retrieved during a second visit to the family home. Adrian Vale's comparison sample came from a sealed forensic reference held by an attorney Ethan located through estate filings. Vale had died years earlier. But the sample existed and it was valid. I kept working while I waited. Kept reviewing foundation documents. Kept replying to my father's suddenly warm texts with one-sentence answers that gave nothing away. Then the results arrived. I opened them alone in my grandmother's kitchen. Both hands flat on the table. Something in me already knew the floor was about to shift. My father was my biological father. No ambiguity at all. Camille was not his biological daughter. Camille matched Adrian Vale. I read it 3 times. Then I sat in complete silence while every memory I had ever tried to explain with simple family dysfunction. Maybe they were stressed, maybe I reminded them of something, maybe I was just difficult, rearranged itself into something uglier and far more precise. My mother had not rejected me because I disappointed her. She had rejected me because I was proof of the life she had chosen to perform over. My father had not failed to protect me because he didn't know better. He had failed because he knew exactly what was happening, and still chose the version of the family that kept his marriage and his image intact. Camille had been the treasured center of that household because she represented my mother's hidden loyalty. The man she had loved before the marriage she had built her entire identity around. And I had been sent away the moment I started looking too much like the man whose continued presence made the lie harder to maintain. When I was 7, I had asked one innocent question at breakfast. Why do I look exactly like Dad, but Camille doesn't look like either of you? I still remember the way my mother's face changed. The way the house went quiet that night. The way the suitcases appeared the next morning, already packed, too neatly. For years I thought that memory was too dramatic to trust. Now it made perfect, devastating sense. I wasn't removed because I was difficult. I was removed because I was observant. I told them I needed full financial documentation before releasing a single dollar. My father replied within the hour. Why was I making this so complicated? I requested vendor contracts, salary justifications, reimbursement policies, governance documents showing actual independent oversight. What came back was a mess. Dates inconsistent. Line items that didn't add up. Launch expenses padded before the foundation had served a single person. I told them no funds would move until an outside forensic review was complete. That was when the masks came entirely off. My father said I was embarrassing the family. My mother called me ungrateful. Camille texted me after midnight, "Grandma would have wanted us united, Naomi." The emotional choreography was so deliberate it would have been impressive if it weren't so painfully transparent. I recorded every call. Kept every email. Saved every voicemail. Then the article appeared. It didn't call me a criminal. People with social training are usually too careful for that. Instead, it framed me as a brilliant but volatile founder whose personal instability had complicated a family charitable initiative. It implied my judgment was clouded by unresolved resentment. It was just subtle enough to sound credible and just precise enough to do real damage. Within 72 hours, 2 consulting conversations went cold. A healthcare system asked to pause our contract discussions. A client quietly reduced my involvement on a compliance project worth nearly $2 million over the coming year. Nobody said the article was the reason. Nobody ever does. Reputation damage among wealthy professionals never arrives with an explanation attached. It arrives as hesitation. As distance. As people who were enthusiastic about knowing you last week suddenly becoming very hard to reach. Then fabricated emails started circulating. Messages supposedly from an address nearly identical to mine, implying I had threatened to expose family secrets unless financial arrangements were made. The language was melodramatic and clumsy, nothing like anything I would ever write. But it didn't matter yet. What mattered was that those emails existed long enough to be forwarded and whispered about in rooms I wasn't in. My attorney Dana Whitlock looked at everything and said, "This is no longer a family conflict. This is fraud, defamation, and fabricated evidence." Dana was exactly the kind of lawyer you want when people have spent years confusing your patience with weakness. She had me stop all direct engagement, preserve every communication through documented channels, and begin building a litigation file thorough enough to survive any level of public examination. While Dana worked the legal side, Ethan kept digging. The fake email domain had links to an account connected to someone in my mother's orbit. A PR consultant who had worked with her on charity events for years had been quietly placing background talking points with one small publication after another. My parents were not improvising. They were running a coordinated campaign to destroy their own daughter's reputation. The direct financial damage crossed $2 million in projected work within a single month. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive to Boston and throw the DNA report across that perfect terrace table. But anger is expensive when the other side is counting on you to become reckless. So I did the exact opposite. I got colder. I cataloged everything. Every article. Every suspicious email header. Every contradiction between their public charity language and their private financial behavior. And then Dana found the mistake that would break everything open. In a filing prepared to threaten me with legal action, they had attached copies of the fabricated emails as though they were authentic evidence of extortion. They hadn't just circulated the lies privately. They had submitted manipulated materials inside a legal proceeding, where forensic review could and would destroy them completely. My father, in his panic, had done what people do when they'd been untouchable for too long. He assumed his performance would survive examination. He forgot who he was dealing with. I had built my entire career around looking closely at exactly what other people hoped no one would ever examine. I told Dana to file everything. Not the soft version. Not the careful version. Everything. The pre-trial hearing happened on a gray morning in Boston. By the time I walked into that courthouse, I felt strangely calm. Not peaceful. Not healed. Just finished with being afraid. My father was there in an expensive suit that suddenly looked like it belonged to a smaller man. My mother in navy silk, polished as always, as if good tailoring might still be enough to save her. Camille sat rigidly between them, trying to hold herself together and losing it every time she glanced across the room at the binders stacked in front of Dana. Dana started with the money. Because money is always where people like my father believe they're safest. She laid out the entire structure. Personal compensation before any charitable work existed. Vendor relationships feeding directly into family insiders. Pre-launch spending with zero charitable output. False representations used to leverage my name and reputation without my consent or knowledge. The judge asked simple questions in a voice so quiet it made every answer sound more devastating. How many scholarships had been awarded? None. How many beneficiaries had been served? None. Why had executive compensation begun before any programming existed? No coherent answer came. My father's attorney tried to frame it as mismanagement during a rushed and enthusiastic launch. Then Dana moved to the forged communications. No drama. No theater. She submitted metadata reports, domain registration records, server traces, language pattern comparisons, and a complete digital forensic summary linking the fabricated emails directly to accounts and devices originating from within my mother's own operation. The courtroom went so still I could hear someone shifting papers 3 rows back. My father's face changed. Not into shock. Into defeat. Thorough, complete defeat. The kind that only arrives on the face of someone who has been dreading a specific moment for 30 years and just watched it walk through the door. My mother looked like she had been struck. Camille stared at the projected report for a full second too long, and then her whole body went rigid. Then Dana requested permission to introduce evidence related to motive, pattern, and long-standing family deception directly connected to the present fraud. The judge allowed it. And the DNA reports entered the record. Dana read the summary cleanly and without drama. I was Charles Mercer's biological daughter. Camille was not. Camille matched Adrian Vale, the man my mother had buried under 30 years of careful, curated social performance. Silence. Then Camille turned to my father. Slowly. The way people move in moments that split their life into before and after. She asked one question in a voice I barely recognized. You knew? It wasn't really a question. My father lowered his eyes and gave the smallest nod I have ever watched destroy another human being. Camille looked at my mother next. What left her face in that moment wasn't just rage. It was the collapse of an entire structure she had believed in her whole life. People think identity lives in names and records and blood. What I watched leave my sister was not just certainty about her biological father. It was certainty about her entire life. My mother tried to interrupt. Said the test was irrelevant. Said it was an attack. Said I had no right. Dana reminded the court that the defense had already submitted fabricated materials in a legal context and that the DNA evidence was materially connected to decades of concealment that had directly motivated the fraud they were there to address. The judge agreed. And then the final blow. Because in using forged emails to support an extortion claim inside an actual legal proceeding, my mother had committed an act that was legally material and demonstrably false in a way that could not be walked back. The judge referred the matter for criminal review immediately and requested the district attorney be notified regarding false reporting and fraudulent submission of evidence. My father's attorney asked for time. The judge gave him almost none. Camille walked out before anyone could stop her. My father sat perfectly still, like a man who had just discovered that cowardice accumulates interest and eventually demands full payment. My mother stood to object again. But her voice shook so badly that even she seemed to hear what it had become. There is a moment when certain people finally understand that charm has run out of room. I watched that moment happen across both their faces. The poise. The certainty. The lifelong confidence that they could rearrange truth simply by performing loudly enough over it. Gone. For the first time in my life, they could not control what came next. They could not rewrite what had happened in that room. They could not make me the difficult daughter, the unstable founder, the family problem with the unresolved bitterness and poor judgment. They had maintained the lie so carefully, for so long, that they had forgotten one essential thing. Lies collapse hardest when the person forced to live underneath them finally stops protecting everyone else from the sound. In the months that followed, consequences arrived the way they always do in families built on image. Not explosively. Relentlessly. My mother took a plea once the forensic case became impossible to outrun. Between the fraudulent foundation structure, the false reporting, and the fabricated materials submitted in court, her lawyers negotiated hard and still couldn't save her from the one thing she had spent her entire life believing only happened to other people. Public disgrace with permanent legal record. 5 years. My father retired before his firm's board could make the decision for him. The official statement used the phrase stepping back for personal reasons, the bloodless language institutions use when everyone understands that scandal is the real cause but nobody wants to attach a noun to it. The social world they had spent decades assembling together fell apart faster than I expected. Invitations stopped arriving. Committee seats dissolved. People who had praised my father's judgment and my mother's elegance developed an immediate and lasting loyalty to distance. That part didn't surprise me. Social circles built entirely on image don't punish corruption because it's wrong. They punish it because it became embarrassing. Camille was gone for a while. When I eventually heard where she had settled, it came through Dana, through the legal channels that open up when families begin dividing themselves publicly. She had left Massachusetts. Stopped using Mercer. Rented a small apartment in Portland under the name Camille Vale. I sat with that information for a long time. We were not equal victims, I'll never pretend we were. She had occupied the place I was denied for 30 years. But she had been constructed entirely from the same dishonesty that hollowed out everything else, and she hadn't chosen that any more than I had. My father reached out once, months after the hearing. He told me there had always been a trust in my name. Funded years earlier. $1.2 million, protected and waiting. He offered it in the language of late regret, proof, he said, that he had loved me in the only cowardly way he had been capable of. I didn't yell. By then rage had become too easy and too obvious a gift to hand him. I just told him the truth. Money you hid for 30 years is not the same thing as showing up. Then I hung up. When the trust matured and the settlement funds cleared, I made the first decision in my life that felt completely clean. I took my grandmother's name and built something no one in my family could ever touch. The Margaret Hale Foundation. Structured the way the Mercer Legacy Foundation had only ever pretended to be. Independent board. Transparent governance. Outside auditing every year. No family positions. No vanity salaries. No emotional manipulation dressed up as mission language. Full-ride scholarships for students from fractured homes. Children who were brilliant but unseen. High-achieving but carrying things no kid should have to carry. The kinds of young people who had learned too early that love and consistency are not guaranteed to arrive together. I added a mental health stipend to every single award. Because education changes a future. But healing changes the person who has to live inside that future every single day. Building the foundation didn't erase anything that had happened. But it gave my anger a direction that didn't rot me from the inside. And slowly, I built something else. Something that took longer and mattered more than any of it. A chosen family. A therapist who never once asked me to be more forgiving than I was honest. A handful of friends I could call without editing myself into something easier for them to receive. People who showed up not because I had become successful enough to deserve their time but because I was worth knowing before I was worth anything to them financially. That was the strangest part of the whole healing process. Not the absence of pain. The absence of performance. I no longer had to be extraordinary before I had earned my seat at the table. I no longer had to succeed loudly enough to be noticed. I no longer lay awake wondering whether being cared for would be quietly revoked the second I stopped being convenient to someone else's story. A year after the hearing, I sat in my grandmother's kitchen in coastal Maine. The air smelled like cedar and salt the way it always had. The house was quiet in the way it gets in early morning before the world starts up again. And I thought about the girl I had been at 7 years old, sitting at a breakfast table in Boston, asking one innocent question about faces. Not knowing that question was about to cost her the next 25 years of her life. I wish I could go back and tell her something. I wish I could tell her that the adults around her were not powerful because they were right. They were powerful because she was small, and they were willing to use that against her. I wish I could tell her that one day she would stop confusing their rejection with her value. Because here is the thing I know now that I needed to know then. My father didn't call my graduation a failure ceremony because I had failed. He called it that because he needed me to believe I had. Because a daughter who believed she had failed would be easier to control than a daughter who knew exactly what she was worth and wasn't afraid to act on it. He didn't send me away because I was hard to love. He sent me away because I was impossible to hide. Those are not the same thing. They were never the same thing. What he and my mother did was not a verdict on my value. It was a verdict on their courage. And their honesty. And the choice they made every single day for 30 years to protect their carefully constructed image at the direct expense of their own daughter. That is their failure. It was always only ever their failure. They called my graduation a failure ceremony. They packed my suitcases when I was 7 without a single honest word of explanation. They came back only when my success made me worth something to them again. They built a fake charity in my grandmother's name. They planted stories about me in the press. They forged emails. They tried to take everything I had built, my money, my name, my reputation, my future, and quietly use it to save themselves from consequences they had been outrunning for 3 decades. But here is the thing about people who underestimate you for long enough. They stop watching. And when they stop watching, you build. I built a company they said I never could. I found evidence they were certain would stay buried. I hired people they didn't know existed. I collected proof they assumed would disappear. I walked into a courtroom they never once imagined I would enter, and I let the truth do exactly what truth does when it finally has enough room to breathe. It burned everything they had constructed straight down to the ground. And I walked out of that ash not angry. Not broken. Not the difficult daughter. Not the unstable founder. Not the bitter outsider they had spent years and real money trying to convince the world I was. I walked out as exactly who I had always been underneath every single story they had ever tried to assign to me. The woman my grandmother stood up for in a crowded auditorium. The woman who trusted a business card tucked inside a cedar chest by the only person who had ever loved her without an agenda. The woman who turned pain into evidence and evidence into accountability and accountability into a foundation that tells overlooked kids every single year. Somebody sees you. Before the world ever gets the chance to teach you to disappear. They called it a failure ceremony. They were wrong. It was the beginning. And if you have ever been made to feel invisible in the place that was supposed to be your home, if you have ever watched your worth get measured strictly against your usefulness, I need you to hear this clearly. Their inability to love you correctly was never evidence that you were unworthy of love. It was always, only, evidence of their limitation. You don't owe them your silence. You don't owe them your future. You don't owe them a single explanation for the life you choose to build without them. What you owe yourself is the life your younger self would have felt completely safe inside. Go build it.